Thanks to all of you for coming as well, by the way. You're very lucky to have an institution like SDI here, incidentally, because it's, I think, one of the few groups in the UK that's really supporting, making, funding, distributing creative documentaries, and that is willing to take a risk with experimental work. So I've had a lot more luck and support from SDI, for example, than I have from my local filmmaking funds, from BritDoc, from other British-wide general documentary funding projects. So you're in a good place. And considering last night's news, you're also lucky to have a government that knows the difference between killing people and not killing people. So for those of you who are Scottish, count yourselves lucky. How many? I want to get an idea of what I should focus on, because I can talk for hours on anything. I don't know how many of you have seen any of the films, or how many of you are filmmakers, for example, who might want more practical advice sort of experience, or how many of you are more interested in the academic side. So let's start with, how many of you are filmmakers? Or want to be filmmakers? Oh, great. Okay, excellent. And are you interested in? How many of you are interested in more practical advice on, say, developing an idea, getting a film funded, getting a film made? Okay. How many of you are interested in stuff about camera technique, anything technical, camera-wise? Okay. All right. And how many? I'm assuming you haven't seen my latest film, because it hasn't screened in Edinburgh in Scotland. Have any of you seen it? Tell Spring Not to Come This Year. You've seen it? Oh, great. Where did you see it?
In the front line.
Oh, okay. Excellent. In London. Okay. All right. So I think what I'll do is talk about the work I've done, but I don't want to go through my films chronologically. I think that's it's a bit boring, and if you haven't seen them, it's not like I'm a famous director and you're following my career, so it's not, I'm not going to do like a filmography. I'm more interested in talking about themes and ways that we can look at film, and so there are certain themes that are going to tie several ideas together. So when they come up and when they're relevant, I'll play you clips from my films, and as I think of other things that might be related, I'll play you clips. My presentation style tends to be a bit stream of consciousness, so if you can't follow me, or if you have any questions at any time, please just ask questions immediately. So it doesn't have to be a formal presentation. I think what we'll do in terms of the structure is I'll talk for about an hour, right? And then, because we have 2 hours for the whole thing, right?
I think we have until 5, but so you can talk for a little bit longer, and just whenever you feel like it, and then you can open up to Q&A.
Yeah. Okay, I can talk for an hour, and then we can open up for more of a specific Q&A if you want to do it like that. Great. I'll start with my background, how I got into film. Not as a how-to, but just so you understand where I'm coming from when I speak. I didn't go to film school. I was just a fan and a lover of cinema from a very early age, and I made films with my parents' camcorder and my friends, since I was about 6 years old, 8 years old. So it's always been part of my life, and I fell in love with cinema at a very early age. So it was always there. It was always something I knew I wanted to do. I assumed I would go into fiction. And I still have a lot of interest in fiction, but since 2004 I've been doing documentary films, mainly because when I got older, I studied documentary photography at university, but not film, and I just became more politicized, I would say, more aware of politics, more aware of my own family history. I'm Palestinian. My dad was born a refugee in Syria, and we moved around the world a lot, like most refugee families or most immigrant families, whatever you want to call us. So I started making documentaries because that was my way of talking about politics, but in a way that made sense to me. So I had a career, or the beginning of a career, as a campaigner and an activist, and I worked in mobilization for marginalized communities. I did a lot of work against sanctions on Iraq, for example, before the 2003 invasion. But it became quite clear to me after a few years that it wasn't really my thing. I didn't want to be a campaigner. I didn't want to be a professional political activist. But film for me became a way of transforming that anger and frustration and voice into something constructive that I think could be constructive, I hope. But because my way into cinema was very non-traditional, I'm going to be talking about very non-traditional ways of doing things. So I really don't do anything the way that a regular film school might tell you to do things. My way of making, distributing, funding films is very non-commercial, so I also generally I'm not interested in making money. I make enough to live. It's very little, but I'm making the films that I want to make. That's my priority. So take everything I say with some cynicism, in that you need a certain number of things to go right at the same time for it to work. But hopefully, one of these bits of advice somewhere along the way is useful. But also, where there's some really obvious difference between, say, how commercial docs or the mainstream industry would work and I work, I'll usually point that out as well, just so you don't get totally lost and distracted. Especially those of you who are students who are pitching your projects tomorrow. I don't send you off on a totally different course. Or maybe I do. In fact, I do. Yes, I do. So the first theme I want to talk about, or the first kind of overarching priority, I think. And I feel like documentary films are very much an exercise in overcoming barriers and overcoming obstacles. So whenever you start a documentary film, there is always the kind of ideal project, but we'll almost never achieve it. What we achieve is some sort of compromise. But that's the beauty of documentary, that this is real life. So I don't think we ever really want perfection or the idealized project. We want the project that comes out of our real experiences. That we want that bit of unpredictability, or that bit of wildness that's left. And so what we end up with, I think, is really a series of obstacles to the idealized film, and we have to come up with creative ways of getting around those obstacles. The most clear one for me in this industry today is differentiating yourself. Because when I started out making documentaries, in 2004, it was still on its way to becoming a much bigger industry, but it was still small enough that there was not much concern with making commercial films. You could get commissioned by television relatively easy compared to what it's like today. My first television commission was for Al-Jazeera English. They had just started up around 2004, and I think I sent them my first film, which I'm going to talk to you about now, several copies. I just kept sending DVDs until they replied to my email, and then they invited me in. I walked into the office. I pitched the idea, and he said, "Great, you have £20,000, go and make the film." So that was a very different, that doesn't happen today anymore, unfortunately. So I was creating films in a time when it was not as big an industry as it was now, and there weren't as many documentary filmmakers. Today, one of the biggest challenges is how do you create a distinct voice for yourself? How do you make a film that doesn't look like the film that everyone else has made or can make or will make? And that's particularly interesting or important for me because I do a lot of work in conflict zones. I do a lot of work in dangerous parts of the world. The film I just made was on the front line in Afghanistan with the Afghan National Army. So if I'm going to put myself in a situation like that, where I'm literally risking my life to make a film, there's no reason I would do that to make a film that I think anyone else could make. I'm only going to do that if I think I can bring something new to that subject. I don't want to remake the same war film that we've seen 1,000 times, right? So it's crucial that I can think, okay, what is it that I have that's different? What can I bring to the film that's different? So we're talking about your voice as a filmmaker, and I think because of the constraints of the industry now, what you come across very often is people who want to turn your project into something that they can get behind. So instead of what I think is the ideal, where we have an idea for a film and we go and find people who want to fund that film, what's much more common is you have an idea for film and people say, if you make it like this, we'll support it. If you make it like this, we'll support it. I was never really interested in that because I took this voice as a filmmaker to be literally the voice of us as individuals. So in the same way that someone might say, well, if your film had a presenter and you made it, in 2 halves of 30 minutes in English, it would be much more interesting to us. Basically, it's like saying, I like you, but if you were a bit taller and your voice was a bit deeper and you shaved, I think we'd get along much better. So I never saw the point in being that first kind of filmmaker, especially because I came to it out of passion. I didn't come to it because I was bedazzled by the film industry and I thought, oh great, documentaries will be a good way in. Sadly, there are people who, I guarantee you, wanted to be in the film industry but thought documentaries would be a slightly less corrupt and more ethical way of doing it and thought it would give them a good reputation, and so that's what they went into. And I think you should avoid those people because they're not interested in making the same sort of films that I assume we are interested in making. So if we say that our most precious asset is our voice, as in what the individual way that we tell stories, and if you think of the filmmakers that you admire, this is certainly true for me. When I think, let's say I like, have any of you seen A Syrian Love Story? This Sean McAllister's new film. So if we take that as an example, if I said I like A Syrian Love Story, I don't like it because I thought that the camera work was brilliant. In fact, the camera work's pretty terrible, and Sean knows that, that's his thing. I don't like it because I think it's well edited, or the color grading is great, or the sound mix is really good, even though all those may be true. But I like it because it tells me something I didn't know about the world, and that's because it's in Sean's voice. You can, when you meet him, you know he made that film because it's him. It's him looking at the world, and it's people looking at his world through the camera and through talking to Sean. So there's something very distinct about that. That's very important creatively because we all know now what a Sean McAllister film feels like, and that's important, and Sean knows what he's good at doing. It's also very important professionally because when you go to pitch a film, people can say, all right, I know the sort of film that you're talking about. I understand your language because I've seen what you've made. You have a kind of distinct character. And the way we get to that character, I think, should be very natural. The voice of your films should be your voice. I don't think it's something that we want to construct, but it is something that we need to work at a lot. So it takes a lot of time, not only making films, but also watching films and seeing what you like and don't like. So this is my 4th long documentary, let's say. I made 3 others that were, one that was feature length, it was 90 minutes, 2 that were an hour long. This is my 4th long form, it's 83 minutes. And then I've made probably 10 kind of TV docs from half an hour to sort of 3 or 4 minute news documentaries. And each time I make those, I'm developing that voice. So I'm figuring out what feels right, what feels wrong, what's natural, what's not natural. And every time I go to something like this, like a masterclass or watch someone else's films or whatever, I'm absorbing that information and seeing, would that work for me? Is that advice that I can use? Is that a technique that I can use? So I have this very kind of magpie approach to filmmaking, that I collect as many resources and sources and references as possible. And it's almost like, you know, when you're trying to figure out if your pasta is cooked, you throw it, well, you don't do this anymore, but anyway, the old thing was like, I never did it, but anyway, you know what I mean. The story of the myth, I don't even know if it works. You throw it at the wall, if it sticks, it's done, right? Or it's not done. This is probably the wrong metaphor. There's something notable about the pasta at that point. You're throwing it at the wall and you see if it sticks, you see if it works. And there are very distinct moments. I think it takes a while to develop that skill of understanding your film is going to tell you what's right at various points. So when you start editing things together, and I think you learn to spot this more as you make more films, that there are times when you look at it and it's saying this is wrong. You're trying to do this. You can physically do it, of course. You can cut anything together. But there's always a moment when you look at a scene and for some reason it works. Because everything seems to fit in the right way and it flows in the right way. And it's basically the material telling you, this is how I'm comfortable. Because you've approached the subject in one way. You've shot the material in one way. You've edited the material in one way. And if all of those work properly together, then they're synchronized. They have the same volume. They have the same dynamic. They have the same character. So I can look at old films and see when I tried something and it didn't work because it seems unnatural, or it seems wrong, or something sticks out. You see what I mean? And I'm not embarrassed by any of the work I've done before. I have quite a sort of renegade approach to films. I'm very meticulous, but at some point I think, okay, it's done. I have to put this out into the world and see how people react to it. But there are things that I do see in old films where I regret because clearly the material was telling me I was making a mistake. So my point is that what we value is that individual voice should be something very natural that develops out of our way of seeing the world. And undoubtedly, every one of us has something unique in the way that we see the world, and that's something valuable that we need to exploit. That's something that gives your films a character that they wouldn't ordinarily have. So when we start thinking about a subject that's interesting, I think we need to realize why we're the person making that film. And I think the worst reason is this is going to be a big news story. I'm going to make a documentary about it because it'll be successful. And that can work, don't get me wrong. There are a lot of films that are made like that. Some of them are good. Some of them are just functional. You know, they sort of inform you about that subject, and that's fine. But personally, when I watch those films, I don't feel a passion. I don't feel like I'm seeing a new perspective on the world. I want to see a new perspective on the world. We have so much access now to information from almost everywhere imaginable that I don't need more information. What I need is different information. I need people's perspectives. So my interest has always been the human, individual, ground perspective. My interest has never been about the politics. My interest is what happens at the end of that process. When we go all the way down the line from what politicians have decided to what their politicians are enacting to what the individual people in that country have to deal with. So since the beginning of the war in Afghanistan, or let's say since 2004, when I started making documentaries, I wanted to make a film about Afghanistan because I'm interested in the major events of our time, a different perspective on the major events of our time. And clearly Afghanistan, the war there is one of them. But how do you make a film about a war? It's very difficult if you're a humanist, if you're interested in oral history rather than official history. You need people, you need individuals. So it took that long, 12 years, 13 years, to find a way of telling that story from the human perspective. And I was very lucky that story came to me. So the co-director had never made a film before, but he contacted me and said, I have this idea for a film. Why don't we embed with the Afghan army to see what the war looks like from their perspective? And I knew immediately that was an incredibly powerful idea, because all we've ever seen of the war, almost all we've seen, is from the perspective of foreign soldiers. And from the perspective of the United States and Britain. If you live here, basically all we saw was the UK army. And that's an important story, don't get me wrong. And again, there are some good films made about foreign soldiers. But what do we know about the Afghans? Almost nothing. So this was a way of telling the other side of the story. And there are no politics in the film, because politics didn't affect those people's lives. It was about what happens at the end of that political process. So whenever I'm looking at a subject, I'm trying to find people that I can live with, people that I can film on a daily basis. And through their stories, you know, the old adage of the personal is the universal. Through those people's stories, I'm talking about war in general. I'm talking about Afghanistan in general. I'm talking about the future of the country. What do people there hope and desire and dream? But I'm not doing it by saying, I did some research and here are the statistics on what Afghans hope for. I'm doing it through the experiences of two people in the case of this film. Most of my films are about one person, and that's it. I tell the entirety of that through one person. So when I came to make my first film in 2004, I was living in Morocco, and I had been working for a travel company, so I was leading tours, sort of adventurous tours around the country. And I kept hearing about migration, what they call hijra sirriya. It's like the secret migration. Because there were thousands of men, almost exclusively men, every month trying to cross into either Spain or France, across the Mediterranean. So this was kind of the biggest wave of migration prior to this year. Now we're sort of seeing unprecedented levels, but at the time in 2004 they were talking about also unprecedented levels. And so I had two kind of hidden stories that were intriguing to me. One was this idea that Europe is being flooded by thousands of migrants. Thousands of them are also unfortunately drowning in the Mediterranean. But all I was hearing was France's perspective, the government of France. What's Britain's perspective? What's Spain's perspective? I had no idea who the people were who were actually making these journeys. And then I was living in Morocco and hearing a lot about the country, the sort of vision of the country that they want tourists to see, but with this secret layer of what's happening under the surface. And that was the collapse of the economy, new barriers in Europe that were changing Morocco's relationship. So I wanted to understand who were these people that were risking their lives to go to Europe, and why. And so I borrowed money to buy a camera, taught myself how to use the camera, and I went back to Morocco and I moved to Tangier, where most people make the journey from. And I just looked around at hotels. I just asked people, I started to talk to people to find someone to tell the story about. And in fact, it was very easy. It took 2 days. I met someone and he agreed to let me film his journey around Morocco and ask him a lot of questions. And that was really the beginning of my education. That was my way of, instead of doing film school, I just made a film. And what I learned there completely changed my approach to filmmaking. So let me show you a clip from, you have to go around this thing. From that film. It was called I See the Stars at Noon. And we released it in 2005. Let me see where it is. Oh yeah, I'll turn it over. So, okay, now technically I do like really good camera work. Technically the camera work is not great in this film. Is it this one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, alright. But anyway, you can forgive it. It was the first film I made. It's messy. So here's a clip from it.
بس انت انسان بتحس بظروف وبتعمل دوكيومنتري، يعني انت كمان بتصير سعيد. يعني ممكن تساعدني منها أخوة بيناتنا، ممكن أرد لك المبلغ إن شاء الله، ويعني وهي فيها جميع المزايا، منها مساعدة منها كل شيء. يعني أنت مش حيطلع لك الدوكيومونتير. لا ما عارف، مش حتلقى إنسان مثلي أنا، يعني إنسان بيساعف ويكون زي، يعني أنا بفهمك يعني وزي أخوك، حبيتك يعني بيقول لي أنا حبيتك، يعني مش الدوكيومونتير ولا حاجة، يعني على دين الدوكيومونتير ما تنشعرش أنا بهاد الدوكيومونتير ديالك ولا العالم، أنا بتهمني أنت الشخص، مش الكاميرا والكاسيت والحاجات ديالك. أنت بتهمك، أنا عارفك يعني حياتك الدوكيومونتير، بس أنا لا، أنا ما عنديش غرض بالدوكيومونتير، ما عنديش. يعني أنا حيشوفوني ناس في لونجلتير، يعني حيشوفوا وشي ويشوفوا حياتي ويشوفوا، بس مش مشكل يعني حيضحكوا شوية على إنسان.
يضحكوا ليه؟
على إنسان مش عارف حاجة، ما عندوش شهادات، ما عندوش دبلومات، مش عارف يعيش في عصر ديال الانترنت وعصر العولمة وعصر، يعني هو لسه عاوز يعمل زي البدائيين، زي الناس اللي زي القرود الأولى، زي الإنسان الحجري، يعني إنسان قديم. ما تمشي للعمل ديالك وتخليني هكاك، انا حنتحر، حيتسمع بالفتاح ترقع يوم تيقولوك عبد الفتاح انتحر، يعني مات. تمشي يعني وتخليني كذا يعني في نص الطريق،
يعني
تخليني في نص الطريق يعني بدون فلوس، بدون.
امتى؟
ودلوقتي يجيك عامل وتمشي كذا يعني بدون ما تحدد معايا موعد.
يعني طبعا ما نقدرش بعد ما وصلنا
لا انت كملت الدوكيومونتير دابا خلاص،
يعني وصلنا للمنطقة ده والنقطة ده، ما اقدرش اقول لك بعد كده لا مش هعطيك ال2000 درهم.
لا مش على 2000 درهم، يعني ممكن انت تكون استغلتني يعني.
ازاي؟
يعني الدوكيومونتير تسالى دابا. يعني وصلنا لواحد النقطة تقريبا النهاية.
ايوه.
يعني ممكن تعمل النهاية هنا بس في الدوكيومونتير.
لا
تصور حاجات أخرى، يعني إن الإنسان ذهب وكذا.
يعني ممكن، بس عايز أكمله.
أيوة عايز تكمله، بس إذا عاوز تحبس ممكن تحبس وتخليني أنا في نص الطريق كذا بدون. بس أنت إنسان بتعرف ظروفي يعني، وزي لو ما كانش الدوكيومونتير حتعطيني مساعدة، ألقاك في الأوتيل وأقول لك أعطيني 2000 درهم تعطيها لي؟ لا. يعني أنت الدوكيومونتير هو اللي جعلك تعطيني 2000 درهم.
وحياتك يعني إذا عملت كل الرحلة ده معك وبعدين في الآخر سألت مني 2000 درهم وعندي هعطيك. بس الحاجة الوحيدة اللي خلتني معاك الأسبوعين دول الدوكيومنتير. يعني إذا قبلنا على البالكون في طنجة وكلمنا، يعني مش هقول لك هاجي معاك عشان أشوف حياتك، يعني مين هيعمل كده؟ يعني بدون الدوكيومنتير ما كنتش أعرفك من الأول أكيد، ما كنتش أزور طنجة أصلا.
So that, what I had imagined making a much more mainstream, objective documentary. That's what I was planning to do. And even when we filmed all of that, and I went back to edit in London with my friend Gareth, who I've edited all of the films with, I said, we have a story, but there's a lot of this talking to me about money and the making of the film that I think is really boring, we have to cut it out. And I think he watched a lot of it and said, no, this is fascinating actually, this stuff is much more interesting than the rest of the story. And so the film is constructed now in a way that the first half seems like a much more normal film where there's not much interaction. And then halfway through the film is this scene where Abdel Fattah turns to me and starts saying, well, what about me? What happens to me? And it completely changed how I make films and how we as a team make films from then on, because suddenly a lot of these ideas that were always very important to me about power structures, about exploitation of vulnerable people, about the representation of other cultures by people who are either foreign or don't live in that country, I mean, I'm not Moroccan, I'm an Arab, but I'm not Moroccan, so, you know, from his perspective, I was a foreigner. How those cultures are represented or misrepresented. And even the economics of documentary film. The fact that when we go in to make a film about a desperately poor country, you know, our camera alone is maybe someone's annual salary. And we need to realize that, we need to understand that. We need to stop lying about it, and we need to acknowledge it, and we need to somehow, I think, make films about it. And not all of my films are this direct, where someone turns to the camera and says, hey, what about money? Are you going to give me some money? What about me? But they're always somehow concerned with the politics of actually representing other people. So in making this film, we were both talking about the subject and talking about how the subject is represented. And that became much more interesting to me from that point on. That my films became really influenced by the media representation of those ideas and how we could subvert them, how we could contradict them. So I spend a lot of time researching in order not to just remake those stories, but to see what the mainstream message is telling us. So I think when we start a film or we have an idea, we need to become experts in that idea. We need to know more than anyone else about that subject. But once you've learned all of that information, you really just want to forget it, because you don't want to make the film as an expert. That research is important so that we know what's out there, what exists, what stories people are already telling about that subject. But I think one of the biggest mistakes we can make is to then make the film saying, I know all this information, how do I convey all this information to the audience? So it's a bit of a contradiction, because when I go and interview someone, for example, I've done a lot of films on Guantanamo Bay, for example. So let's say one of the ex-Guantanamo Bay detainees that I've interviewed. I've researched Guantanamo Bay for 10 years, but there's no way I want to sit someone down and interview them as someone who's researched Guantanamo Bay for 10 years, because the interview is not about information. It's not about how do I tell you how much I know about Guantanamo Bay. It's about much simpler questions. What are their experiences? What did they go through? What is it like now being out? How are they adjusting to life on the outside? These are things that you can't learn in your research. So we need to be both experts before we make the film, but as we're making the film, we need to forget all that information and actually be very naive and be very ignorant about the subject. Because if you know everything there is to know about it, why are you making the film? You're done. There's nothing for you to learn. And more importantly, why are you making a documentary? Because I think we want to know as much as the audience wants to know. And for me, the most interesting films are those films where I feel like the filmmaker is exploring and learning about the subject at the same time that I'm learning about the subject. So there has to be a sense of wonder, there has to be this sense of the unknown or the unexpected or the unpredictable. Otherwise, there's no point in making a documentary. For me, the most interesting part of it is when I'm there on the ground with my camera and there are people there that I don't know and I'm just trying to figure out their lives. And at the same time, they're trying to figure out my lives, obviously. So let me show you a scene from the film I just made in Afghanistan called Tell Spring Not to Come This Year. I just want to show you how that scene you just saw with Abdel Fattah sort of transformed over the years to become sometimes a bit more subtle, but still doing the same thing, which for me is quite early on in the film. I like to tell the audience, remember that this is a film, that I'm standing there with a camera and these people are in front of the camera, and occasionally my presence has some influence on them, and they have some influence on me. So let me play you this speech here. Just kind of, we'll start from here. Hopefully you'll see how my camera work has improved over those 10 years.
مستقل، آزاد، یک اردوی قوی، نیرومند ما داشته باشیم تا ملت خود مردم خود از دست ندیم دوستان. سال 2014 دوستای بین المللی افغانستان اعلام میکنه. تمام صلاحیت‌ها امروز دیده میره که با شما سپاریده شده میره. ما توان داشته باشیم که ما از وطن خود، سرزمین خود، اولاد خود، یتیم خود، مظلوم خود، بیچاره خود، بیمه خود ما دفاع کرده بکنیم. باید یک اردو داشته باشیم.
So that scene for me is the 2015 equivalent of my conversation with Abdel Fattah, because I want to say very early on in the film, these are the people that you're going to watch, these are the people whose lives you're going to be following. And obviously I've told them, sit here, the lighting looks great, stare into the camera, and I just want to see their faces. And these guys, they're getting to know me. Some of them are comfortable. You can see this, how their eyes look around. Sometimes they're staring directly at the camera. Sometimes they look at me. Sometimes they're a bit more comfortable. This guy I always feel like is kind of smirking almost. He's got these very kind eyes. You see a lot there. There's curiosity. There's confusion. You're also seeing me staring at them, and so you're understanding what the filmmaker's perspective is. So these moments for me are these staged moments that just give the film a bit of, I like to be a bit provocative early in the process, where I'm telling the audience, reminding them that the camera is there, so we need to be aware of it all the time. And then there are other scenes where I'll show them to you later, actually. So that's how, and in some of my films I do still talk to people from behind the camera. In this one I didn't, but in some of them I do, and so there is still this exchange. I think when we're trying to find, like I said earlier on, this unique perspective, or that what voice we can bring to a film, it's important to remember that there are many centers to a story. There are many kind of nuclei. So very often if we think of a big story like Iraq, let's say the war in Iraq, and the one center of the story that we always see is, I'm talking about 2003 by the way, the initial invasion of Iraq. The one, I think, center of the story that we always think of is American troops going into Iraq, that war. That's the sort of obvious gravitational force in the story if we're talking about the war in Iraq. Now, if we are not in Iraq, or not prepared to go to Iraq, or can't get an embed with American soldiers, or whatever it is, then we need to think of a different way of covering that war, if that's something that's important to us. But what we don't want to do, I think, is make a film about the American invasion of Iraq, but in London. So I might make a film, this is why you see very often a film like, I might make a film about a British Iraqi and what are his feelings about the American invasion of Iraq, for example, if I had started in 2003. Now you can make that film, but I think there's a mismatch when we start to tell stories like that between the peripheral story that we are actually looking at and the gravitational pull of all the other stories. If we're telling a peripheral story, like an Iraqi living in Britain, Iraqi living in London or Edinburgh, he or she has their own story. They have their own center of gravity. So their story has its own kind of black hole at the center that everything is revolving around. So we should be telling that story. We don't want to tell stories from a distance just because we're not there. There are experiences that Iraqis in Britain have had that are just as important and real as the experiences that Iraqis in Iraq are having. So we should always look for the peripheral stories if we're not telling the mainstream news story, but making sure that we find the right heart of that story, so that it's not just a side door into a subject, that you're actually telling the entire world of that subject as fully as possible. So what we did in 2009, we made a film for, I think it was 2009, for Al-Jazeera, for Witness. You know, they have a strand called Witness, which is like personal stories. This is Al-Jazeera English. And we told a story about a soldier who willingly joined the American army, but into his deployment, a few months into his deployment, he became a born-again Christian, really hardcore Christian, and he became a pacifist. And so he had decided that he was against all war, and he wanted to be recognized as a conscientious objector. And he wanted to leave the army as with a formal discharge, but being recognized as a conscientious objector. And we found the story through another very interesting contact that I had made years ago. So this is another reason why I always advocate just keeping track of anything that you find interesting or inspiring, or names or contacts. So as we develop stories, our list of resources and points of inspiration becomes like gold dust. You know, I've got stacks of notebooks with names and numbers and bits of paper in there, because 5 years later, when I think, oh, we want to make a film about conscientious objectors, I met this guy in Jerusalem 3 years ago who told me he works with conscientious objectors in Germany, because there's a big American base in Germany, and he runs a center that helps get people out of the army. Sometimes legally, sometimes semi-legally or illegally. And so that's exactly what happened. I was doing another job in Jerusalem, and I met an American who was with a German tour group. And I said, what do you do? And he said, I run this thing called, what is it called? MCN, Military Counselling Network, that was it. In a small town in Germany. And he said, I'm a Mennonite Christian, we're pacifists, and we help get people out of the army. And I took his number and remembered his name. And then 3 years later, when we wanted to make this film about Iraq, but not in Iraq, I contacted him again, and I said, we want to make a film about some of the people that you work with. So that became, that contact became then the sort of our way into that world. And it was quite lucky that we had planned it as a fairly mainstream documentary, where we went to Germany, we did some interviews, we watched some of the sessions where they do counseling with soldiers that have left the army, and a lot of the stories were sort of retrospective. So it was people who had already left, and we were interviewing them, or we were using archive footage. And then one of the contributors pulled out. He was supposed to be one of the sort of main contributors to the film, and he decided that he didn't want to work with Al-Jazeera because it was still associated with as a sort of terrorist network. And you know what I'm talking about. So he didn't want to be associated with it. And we thought that then our film was screwed. We had nothing. And I came back to London, and a few weeks later I got a call from Michael, who's the guy who ran the Military Counselling Network. And he said, oh, you remember Robert? He's one of the cases that I told you about, who was applying for conscientious objector status. I said, yeah, I remember him. He told me about some emails that he had sent him. He said, well, Robert applied to be recognized as a conscientious objector. They turned his application down, but he decided to go on the run and leave the army. And he's agreed to let you follow him. And I had no idea why. I mean, this guy didn't know who I was at all. But when he phoned Mike and said, I'm going on the run, can you help me? Mike had said, sure, here's my advice. And by the way, can this guy who's been filming with me come on the run with you? And I guess Robert, because he really wanted to tell his story, he said yes. So the film became, a small part of it was interviews with those guys, but the crux of the film was, again, this totally unexpected experience where I flew into a small town in Pennsylvania, met Robert Weiss, and then the next day he missed his troop deployment and went into hiding. And I followed him and told this story about a whole network of pacifists in the US that help smuggle soldiers in and out of their houses. Just a fascinating world. But it's a world that I had never heard of, that I had no access to. And for me, that was my Iraq war film. So, I looked at the landscape of war films on Iraq, and I just thought, if I make a film like everyone else is making, there's nothing I can contribute to. I could put my life at risk to embed with British troops, but I would probably tell the same story that 1,000 other people had told, and also that 1,000 other people could probably tell better than me, right? People who knew the military, people who specialized in making war films, maybe television channels that had the resources to pay for all that insurance, pay for training, pay for your equipment. And so I don't try to compete, if that's the right word, with other productions on their terms. I don't try and say, okay, Channel 4 is making their ISIS film, I'm going to make that film but better. I would never do that because I don't have the resources of Channel 4. I'm not going to try and make a Dispatches but a better Dispatches. I'm going to try and make the film that Channel 4 couldn't make or Channel 4 won't make. So I always try and think, could someone else make this film? And if I think yes, then I won't make it, because why would I? If my film is an idea that anyone else could easily take and do themselves, then there's no point in me making it. That for me is a sign that it's not a very good documentary idea. If it's really your documentary film, it should be a film that only you can make. So I'll show you a clip from that film. This one also has messy camera work, but that's because of the circumstances. I had a tiny camera. Obviously we were on the run, so it had to be hidden.
AWOL, away without leave. My application for conscientious objector status was turned down. So at this point I feel I have no real legal avenues for pursuing the recognition of my beliefs. So therefore I have no choice but to leave the military rather than do something I feel is immoral and sinful and wrong. I'm planning on leaving in a few days just in case they do come looking for me, so that I can stay away for 30 days, so that I will be considered a deserter. And rather than being sent back to Iraq, I'll be charged with desertion, as well as missing movement, and then face a military court-martial, and certainly end up in prison, doing some time in jail.
And you're prepared to go to prison?
Oh, absolutely. So
Should we go? I guess you have to, no?
Robert, what's going on? Do you have any idea? Can you give me your idea? Can you run I got a name DOB for you when you're ready. You're not in.
Turn that off, please, while we're working.
We were told by the state troopers that Robert's sister had reported him to the FBI, but they were unable to contact his unit in Iraq, and he was still allowed to board the flight and meet his contact.
I've got
bit of a situation here. There's a soldier who applied for conscientious objection to discharge from the Army, and he was denied, and he has decided not to return. He is trying to find a place to stay for about 3 weeks before he threw himself back over military control. So I was trying to do a little bit of troubleshooting here to figure out if there might be a place for him somewhere around here. I actually thought of your parents. All right, great, thanks.
I'll be going to stay with the sister of a pacifist author whose books myself I've personally read. You know, I appreciate it greatly. You know, there are people that would be willing to put themselves in some sort of measure of risk just to help me out, you know. It's very comforting.
So this is it. There are some empty.
So that, for us, that really became the hook in that film. And it also raised a lot of questions, I mean, obviously ethical questions, but so you have to do your research to know where you stand legally. So if we were stopped by the police and the FBI was after us, but for some bizarre reason they didn't arrest him. But you know, obviously if you're doing more journalistic work like that, it's important to know what your legal rights are as a journalist if you are following someone like that, you know, what you can and can't do, and sort of the line between what's safe and what isn't safe. But aside from that, aside from the legal boundaries, it was also one of the films that raised a lot of questions for us about how much are you willing to commit. Basically, how far are you willing to go to make that film? Because, you know, things could have become more risky for us. He could have decided to do something even more drastic. Then, would we have stayed with him? Would I have still followed him? But what made that film interesting to me, and I thought gave us a whole new perspective on Iraq and on war in general, was that we did go on that journey with him. So it would have been very easy to make a film like this just out of talking heads, right? You can imagine a film, a sort of big cinema documentary just with interviews about pacifists who leave the army or people who run away because they disagree with the war in Iraq or Afghanistan. But I wanted to tell it from a personal perspective, to actually follow someone on their journey, and that way we don't need to tell you what happens because you can see it. You see the whole thing unfolding at the same time. And then you also see occasionally these, similar to the first clip I showed you, where Robert and I talk from behind the camera. And for the majority of my films, I don't do interviews. I don't sit people down and put the camera on a tripod and do a formal interview. I either just talk to them from behind the camera, like you saw there, or what I tend to do now more often is I do audio-only interviews, and I use that audio as essentially their interior monologue. And for me, it works a lot better for a number of reasons. The first is people are just much more comfortable when there's not a camera on them. So if you really, you know, in Afghanistan, for example, we filmed over the course of a year. And we did interviews every time we went to visit. We did hours of interviews. And what we wanted was not the obvious rhetorical answers. You know, the first trip I always make for a film, I always assume that I'm not going to use that footage. That's just, in a way, that's just research for me. There was a great quote from Francis Ford Coppola when he was talking about, I think he was talking specifically about Apocalypse Now, but he said that the first few 100 meters of film, this is obviously when they were still shooting on film, he thinks of them as incense because you're almost burning them as a kind of ritual to say, now we've started making the film. So there's an assumption, and I have to agree, there's always an assumption that the first few hours or days or weeks of footage are just your introduction. You're getting used to those people, they're getting used to you, You get used to the camera. And I film it deliberately. It might be there, it might get used in the film, but I expect that it won't. Yeah?
Since you do journeys as part of at least several of your projects, how do you deal with then perhaps the actual beginning of the journey being undocumented, in effect?
I don't mind that so much. I quite like to jump in the middle of situations sometimes. So I think very often in an edit, there's a lot of that you would probably lose anyway. In this case, we did see the beginning of the journey. I think it also depends, if you do think the beginning of the journey is important, then you should build your film around that. And if you don't have the beginning of the journey and you think it's crucial, then maybe you don't have the film. I mean, there are ways around it, of course. You can get footage from them that maybe they filmed on their mobile phone or on a camera, or if it's an important story, maybe there's news footage of it, or they can talk about it in an interview. But for me, if it's crucial, I think you should be there. If the journey has already started, it may be that you found that story too late, right? And you actually don't have the film that you thought you had. But there are also times when I think you can jump in the middle of a journey. Very often my films do start like that, and in a way for me it's more interesting because it's much more immediate, and you're sort of, if you don't have the preamble, the kind of pre-explanation, then you get that feeling of exploring with the filmmaker, which I really enjoy. Yeah, so I would say if it's a linear story like that, then you need to think about how important the beginning is to the story. But I've done journeys that don't have an end. That's another option. Sometimes they have no end. As long as there are ways of dealing with it creatively, then you can still do it. What was I saying before that? Interviews, yeah. So over that year, we knew that we wanted interviews that got past the rhetorical answers. The first few times, it's like any conversation. When you first meet someone, they're not going to immediately tell you, oh, well, I had this really interesting experience when I was at war in Iraq, or oh, when I was a child in Gaza, this is what it was like growing up, and these were the things I had to live with. That might take a year of friendship and becoming comfortable with someone. So if you're interviewing someone over a year and you want them to be comfortable, then that camera is going to be a real barrier, because it gives them a sense of performance, which you really don't want very often. It's distracting. It can be intimidating. Also for you as the filmmaker, it's another thing to worry about, technically. And then more practically, locations that are good for sound usually don't look good on camera. The ideal location for a sound is just a closed room with soft walls. You don't want bouncy surfaces on the wall. So you're talking about like an audio recording booth or someone's room with blankets on the walls to stop the sound reflecting. And that looks terrible on camera. But a location that looks great, like really interesting texture on the walls and a big window where there's light coming through, and it's probably going to have terrible sound because of all those surfaces. So I don't even bother filming those interviews anymore. We just have a mixer. You want good sound, obviously, so you have to take it seriously. You have a mixer, you have a microphone, and you just sit there and you talk for hours. And that conversation starts off with, how do you feel about the war in Afghanistan, for example, for my last film? And they'll say, oh, great, it's fine. How's it going? It's great, we have a really good army, it's going really well, we'll defeat the enemy. Why did you join the army? Oh, because I'm really proud of my institution and I want to defend my country. And you go through that for several weeks and months, and by the end of it, you get what we got, which I think is very personal, very intimate. But it takes a year of building that relationship of trust with those people in the film. If you see it tomorrow night, hopefully you'll know what I'm talking about, because now it sounds very abstract. But that relationship is crucial. What I think a lot of documentaries suffer from, and I feel like this is a particular, I'm pretty harsh on the British doc industry, so I'm going to pick on it for a bit, but I do feel like this is a particularly British thing, because I think the industry is dominated by television, the budgets are small, our schedules are quite short, so there's not a lot of time for things that the industry sees as superfluous, like caring about people and ethics and humanity. So very often British docs, they act as though the people in their films are somehow in the way, that all they need is for that person to cooperate and we'll get the film done. So there's very little care for those people as individuals, there's very little appreciation of their humanity, and there's very little empathy. I don't feel like a lot of documentaries sympathize or empathize with the people in the films. And for me, that's what's fascinating, especially if it's someone I don't usually empathize with, or I'm not good at empathizing with. One of the things we loved about this film is these conscientious objectors are kind of hard to understand. You know, they willingly joined the army, then they became Christian, decided they were against war, or Buddhist, one of them became Buddhist. But sometimes you watch the interviews and you think, I can't tell if he's genuine or if he just wanted to get out of the army. You know, and then you think, well, why did you join in the first place if you thought you were against war? And then Robert was really weird, because I asked him at one point, what do you think is wrong about killing? And he said, I looked at those Iraqis and I thought if I killed them now, I would deprive them of the opportunity to find Jesus and to become Christian and realize that was the right way. So I said, so it's not that you think it's wrong to kill people, it's that you think it's wrong to kill Iraqis who hadn't had a chance to find God. So, you know, it does not jive with my morality at all. It's a fascinating, bizarre way of looking at the world. And yet, what is the outcome? The outcome is that he became this radical spokesman for pacifism. So it's hard for me to say, no, I disagree with you because you're talking about turning people to Jesus, helping people find Jesus. So these stories where you get this real kind of moral complexity, those are what fascinate me. But you're only going to get that if you are in a relationship where they know you respect them, they respect you, and there's a sense of a collaboration. So when I'm trying to find people to make a film with, or I meet someone and I know I want to make a film with them, the first thing I have to ask myself is, are they willing to take part in this project? Because they're not just actors. We should never call them characters. I hate this term, you hear it a lot when you're talking, oh, who's the main character in your documentary? But they're not characters, they're ordinary people. The term subject is a bit less offensive, but still I find it, you know, we're making the film because we want to give them names. We want them to have stories in their lives. So if they have stories, they're not characters or subjects. That person that you're filming with has to agree to take part in this project, because you're saying, can I stick a camera in your face for 1 year, and you're going to pretty much ignore it, but you're going to let me into the most intimate parts of your life, and then you'll trust that I'm not going to totally misrepresent you and make you look like an idiot in front of everyone. That's a lot to ask of someone. So we need to have this kind of... Film is always an exploitation. It doesn't always have to be a bad exploitation, and it should ideally be mutually exploitative. So I'm exploiting the people in the film because I'm telling a story about them with this camera, and that's my job, and I'm going to put it in film festival, and maybe, if I'm lucky, make some money out of it. But they're also exploiting me because they have someone to tell their story to sometimes. That's important. They have a message that they want to get out. They feel they're misunderstood and they want to represent themselves. Or they understand, because people are not idiots. Most people are actually, they understand how the media works internationally. So the Afghans in that army, they know that most of the world thinks they're corrupt savages. And they wanted to say, all right, finally someone is interested in helping us tell our story. Yeah?
Yeah, I just want to ask, presumably while you're making the film, you're also discovering how you're a lot about the story and maybe changing your perspective on it. So maybe when you approach them, you have a certain idea, and then by the time you're close to editing, you have a very different idea.
Yeah.
So what happens in terms of this honesty with your subject? What happens when what you find interesting and telling about humanity and useful to share for the world to get the idea is jarring with their exploitation of you as a medium to get their message out?
That is almost always the case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
Well, I'm very upfront about it because I know in the beginning, I may not know where my film is going, and luckily my films don't really have plot, so that's not an issue. I never kind of think, oh God, my plot has changed completely, because they don't have. That's fine. But for example, when we went to Afghanistan, we said, this is the film we want to make. We're not interested in this. We've heard it all before. And everyone else around the world has heard it before. We show them, sometimes I show them films. I show them other documentaries. And I'll say, look, this is the kind of film that's been made. This is the side of the war that everyone knows. We want to tell something else. Or we watch TV with them a lot. And what you see on Afghan TV is, they have ads for the army, for one thing, which are really just propaganda, like they are in any country. But they also have what Afghan television calls documentaries, which essentially is also propaganda for the army. So we said specifically, we're not interested in that. But when I say, this kind of burning incense, this ritual thing, there were weeks of us filming them brushing their teeth, shaving, doing their laundry. And sure, the first 10 or 12 times you do that, people say, what the hell are you doing? Why are you filming me do my laundry? This is weird. Hey, look at this guy, he's filming me do my laundry. And that's the footage that you get. But it's the 13th time, when it's no longer a novelty, that you start to see the story. You start to see what you really wanted to see. So we did that for a long time, and we had to we filmed everything we were interested in, and when they would say, oh, we're gonna go train, why don't you film this? And I would say, oh, we're not interested. And two things happen. One is that people start to understand what sort of film you're making. And now they really do get it. I mean, we're still in touch with those guys. And they're very aware that they've seen the film. So they know we made a film that was about them, and there's almost no war in it at all. But the second thing is the people who are not interested in cooperating or being in that kind of film, they fall away. You know that they don't want to do it. So they're not good subjects for the film.
But
So,
there you have lots of options. But if you're following a person and that person falls away because realizes, I mean, say your first film in Morocco.
yeah.
If that realization, if that conversation had happened sooner, I mean, it's hypothetical, but I'm just wondering how you deal with it, because it's ethically, because you're talking about being very honest, but sometimes being very honest pushes them away. Maybe they get it if they watch the film at the end, but maybe sometimes you need to sort of protect them from some of the things you're doing, or you jeopardize getting what you're trying to get.
Well, one of the things I do is I never let people watch what I've filmed. Sometimes you have to, because it's a matter of security, for example, or they might say I need to make sure that they can't identify where I'm from, for example. So then okay, but I wouldn't let people watch hours and hours of footage of them, partly because it's just very boring, and a lot of people don't know that you need 100 hours of footage to make a 30-minute film, for example. But also it makes them very self-aware, and then they become embarrassed and they want to start performing. But that's also something I tell people from the very beginning. It's like, so there's a very basic conversation I have with everyone, which is like, you're not going to edit the film with me, so you have to trust that I'm going to tell that story. You're not going to get to see the footage except in exceptional circumstances. If something drastically changes, then either you still have an interesting film for one reason or another, or or you don't. And there are, you know, I've started a lot of films that never got finished because of that. But that's fine. That's a great way of learning what works and doesn't work. And I think, you know, the more you make, the shorter that sort of research period becomes. I mean, when I don't spend a lot of time, what some people call casting, which again, I hate that term, but I work very instinctively. So if I see someone and I think this is a film, I start filming almost immediately, and that becomes my research. So I want to be the guy that always has the camera, because then they relate to you as the filmmaker. It's not like, you know, I never understood this. People say I spent 6 months becoming friends with them, and then I started filming. But that's a totally different relationship. So, you know, that whole interaction is going to be flipped on its head. And you have no idea what's going to happen then. Someone might be really comfortable and great at talking, and then as soon as you bring out a camera, you know, they're not comfortable at all. So for me, I start a conversation with them from the very beginning with a camera. But that research period becomes shorter and shorter, I think, the better your intuition. So by this point, I think I have a fairly good idea, you know, who in a year or 2 years' time is still going to think, all right, I'm in, this is a good project. And I'm not saying that I want everyone to like the films about them. I don't expect them to always like them. But I will always show them. And what I've found is the films that I thought, I'm really nervous he's going to hate this, they've actually been the most positive. Where someone said to me it was really difficult watching it, but I think it's a really good film. I mean, that's what Abdel Fattah told me about the film about him. He watched it with his mother, because I gave him a DVD. And he said it was really hard, and it was really depressing. And he said, you made my life seem really depressing. And I said, well, look, to be honest, I found it depressing. And the film is as much about me as it is about you. I don't mean that in an egotistical sense, but it's, you know, it's subjective. It's not, and he said, but I think this is a real film. And for him, he meant, like, as opposed to some crappy TV. So I found that people, again, if you establish a real relationship with them, people will respect that. And it may happen that they totally disagree, then, you know, that's a whole nother world of legality and ethics. Then it's up to you to decide if you still want to release it, of course. But, you know, and there are exceptions to everything. If I'm doing an undercover investigation into a war criminal, obviously I don't do this. It's a very different process. When I film undercover, I'm not totally open with everyone, and I don't want to cooperate with them on the film. But I'm talking about this type of observational long-form documentary. Yes, so sometimes when I look at these sort of alternative views, there's also a kind of, what's the word? I like to be a bit provocative. So I think one of the virtues of being naive or ignorant is that it allows us to ask the questions that no one else is asking. And sometimes those are the most revealing documentaries. So there are a lot of subjects where you can look at and think, wow, there's tons of documentaries about this subject, but no one is looking at this. No one is asking this question. And I like to be the person that says, all right, let me ask that question. And sometimes the reason no one has asked is because it's a stupid question, or it sounds like a stupid question. But if you're not willing to look stupid, you can't make documentaries, because you're always going to be the weird person in the corner of the room with a camera and a pair of headphones and probably someone with this boom mic. You know, it looks strange. It doesn't look normal. It doesn't look cool or sexy. You have to be willing to be that weirdo in the corner telling people, oh, don't look at me, just pretend everything's normal. And that's also why I always have images of people looking into camera that are kind of staged, because I like that moment of remember that there's that weirdo in the corner with. But if you're not willing to be that weirdo, it's impossible to make a film that's going to have any kind of life to it, that's going to have any kind of intimacy to it. So that's very similar for me to the concept of asking the stupid question that sometimes people don't ask. So I'm going to show you a clip. This is an example of a film that never got made, but I did the research for it, some of the research. It was about, it's quite a long story to explain it. It was about Palestinian property in Haifa, so it's now in Israel proper, not in occupied territories. But when Israel was created, there was an office created to confiscate Palestinian property, but it had always been held in a trust by the government. So they were sort of complying with international law in a sense that they didn't confiscate the property and turn it over to private owners. They said they were holding it until there was a final settlement, and then they would decide what to do with it. And it remained that way till about 2012 or so. And in 2012 they started secretly selling that property privately, which was against international law, but because nobody knew about it or cared enough about it, nothing happened. So I saw an ad for one of these properties that was being sold, and I had done a bit of research, and I knew 100% that was owned by a family in Lebanon. They had the paperwork. In fact, Al-Jazeera had already done a news report about that family. So I thought, let me ask this stupid question. I will go as a prospective buyer to tour this house, and I'm going to ask them about Arabs that used to live there, or whoever used to live there. Except that I can't find the link. So what do? Wait, where is it? Haifa. Okay, I know what it's going to be. I think it's in here. Yeah. Okay, so this is my kind of funny, provocative bit of research on this one. Whoa, what? No. Okay. No, what? No, why is that happening? It doesn't. That's so bizarre. It's gonna turn on again. Okay.
The Remax agent in charge of the house was happy to show us around.
Before 10 years, maybe more, living the people.
Oh, okay.
But, after go by another apartment in another side of the city.
He doesn't know or wouldn't tell us any details about the history or controversy surrounding the house. Is it the old? Because you mean the original, like the old Arab houses? Is that what you mean?
What?
The old Arab houses? All these? Yeah.
No.
So why?
No.
I don't understand. Okay. But they look like really old houses. I mean, they look like like the Arab houses, you know? Oh. Are you sure there's not going to be a problem with this house?
No.
The agent assured us the house's owner was Israeli.
I have all the papers.
Can I contact the owner? Who is it?
If you really want to buy the, if you want to talk.
Okay.
And if someone...
So that was my kind of funny, provocative way of asking the question that people weren't asking, or maybe going to the source of the story in a way that other people weren't doing it. So again, similarly to some of the other stories I mentioned, I wasn't interested in the bigger political story. Well, I am, of course, but I mean, I've made a lot of films about Palestine, so I find different ways of approaching it. So in this one, I wanted to go into the heart of the story, and that was particularly this one street in Haifa that had this property that all of them were old Arab, well, Ottoman, then owned by Arab houses, and all of them were being sold at the same time and redeveloped.
Can I ask?
In terms, yeah.
Sorry, why didn't that story develop? Why was it not one that?
I don't know. I just couldn't find anyone to put any money into it. You know, it was I still think it's an important story, and it's probably it's probably still relevant. So we found from around 2011, 2012, I think in the first year they had sold maybe 30 properties. In the second year, it was about 60, and then by 2013 or so, it was like several hundred a year. So essentially what they were doing was illegally but very surreptitiously selling the right of return. So legally they couldn't sell this property until a final settlement had been reached. But as soon as those papers are owned by someone else, the people that live there legally no longer have any recourse to take the Israeli government to court. So it was a way of basically undermining international law by de facto selling it. Anyway, it's still happening, and maybe it wasn't dramatic enough. I don't know. But there's a lot of films that I started and never finished. So in terms of this going into a subject from another angle, another film we made in 2007. This was the one I mentioned that I walked into the Al-Jazeera offices and they gave me the commission quite easily. And I had been talking to an old school friend of mine. She was from Gaza, and we decided to make a film about the tunnels that were dug in between Egypt and Gaza. You guys know about this tunnel system? So prior to 2007, there was a really extensive system of tunnels that they had dug between Gaza and Egypt so they could bring things into Gaza, mostly to circumvent the Israeli siege of Gaza. And it included weapons, but also things like medicine, food, a lot of things that people just needed every day. And it was big news at the time that it kept coming up in the news, and particularly it was a very common reason for Israel to justify bombing the Gaza Strip, that they said, oh, we're targeting these tunnels, and these tunnels bring in weapons. So we thought, all right, but what's really happening in these tunnels? People need to know. We hear about Israel's side of the story, and occasionally we would hear the Palestinian side, but at the time Fatah and Hamas were fighting, so there was very little clear information coming out. So we figured, all right, we just have to go to the source, and that is make a film about the tunnels. So make a film about this thing that everyone is talking about in the news, but we're talking about the people. So we're talking about the guy that funds the tunnel and makes money out of it. We met children that dig the tunnels and work there. We met families whose houses had been bombed because they were near the tunnels. So, we took this kind of, I guess I would call it horizontal approach. My style of filmmaking tends to be very horizontal in that it's, I'm almost like an observer just walking through the streets and following someone, and when they meet someone else, I suddenly think, okay, is that part of the story? But what I always keep in mind, because my films, I want them to be very personal or very specific about people, is if something happens that is not relevant to their lives, then it doesn't make it into the film. So, and that happens a lot, especially if you're doing a subject that's political. That when we were in Afghanistan, for example, they had elections, and they had the first peaceful transfer of power from Karzai to Ashraf Ghani, who's the new president. And we filmed the whole sequence with the elections and people talking about them. But what we found was that after the elections, the lives of these soldiers were exactly the same. Nothing had changed. Their strategy hadn't changed. Their daily lives hadn't changed. So it didn't make it into the film. We never pulled out and said, this is the major news story. We just remained with them the entire film. And I think those constraints can be really helpful. I give myself a lot of constraints when I'm making a film. So if I made a film, a really weird one on a ship in the Arctic. And the trip that we did on that ship was 11 days. There was a bunch of artists on this ship. It was like a residency on a sailing ship. And the constraint we gave ourselves was everything in this film every piece of footage and every sound has to come from that ship, from 11 days on that ship. So there's no sound effects from outside, no images that were from the library or that we'd filmed before. And most importantly, all the music was going to be made from these hours and hours of audio recordings that one of the artists had made. So he was a sound artist. And he had recorded, water and ice and the ship creaking and the wind. And we gave this whole library to, I think, 11 or 12 Arctic ambient musicians, sort of North Norwegian genre of electronic dance music, I guess you'd call it, sort of ambient music. And they manipulated those sounds and made music out of it. And sometimes it's still recognizable as the sounds. Sometimes it's just sounds like dance music. But this constraint that everything had to come from that trip gave us a limitation that was very interesting to work with, because the film itself was quite experimental, so we could have done anything. But having those rules gave us this sort of, it was something like a playful challenge to us. And it made it very difficult, but it also gave us a direction, and it gave us a sort of a mission. Similarly with the Afghan film, in the end, after trying a lot of different things, we gave ourselves the constraint that we would never see anything that didn't relate to their lives. We would never leave the theater of war. So we filmed them going shopping for food, getting haircuts. One of them went home on leave and met his family. But we didn't use any of that because we thought, I just want to be inside their heads for that whole, hour and 20 minutes. So I'll show you a clip from the Arctic film. Which one?
Was that the Storyville? Did Storyville pick that up?
No, there was another very similar film that was called Journey to the End of the World or something. That was Janus Metz, a Danish guy. No. So when we were pitching ours, there were people saying, "Oh, I think Janus Metz is making a similar film." So we just finished ours really quickly and kind of ignored Janus Metz. I don't think that his film was that good. I mean, he made Armadillo, which I think was pretty phenomenal, also about Afghanistan. So for me, that second film was a bit of a disappointment. But anyway, I'm sure he's happy with it. All right, where's my thing? Ignore my desktop, so there's probably lots of stuff on there. But here we go. Okay. You have void. So let me find. I'll play you the trailer first, just so you get some idea of what we made. Okay, come on, lights. Go. Yeah. Doing some crazy things. Yes. Okay. Oh, this music is not from the sound files, but anyway.
We were on a mission to rebuild the Arctic. But we had no maps, no master plan.
tell you this in better ways, but I can't.
So I'll play you a clip with some of the music that was made from those sounds. I think that's a good example. It's a pretty weird film. I think it's worth check it out. It's worth seeing. It's an interesting experiment. Oh, I remember now. This is one that. So this was a track
Paul was a smuggler and a racketeer who planned to make money lassoing icebergs and towing them to dry cities to sell on the black market. You see, natural ice was so rare, it had become a precious commodity. They called it cold diamonds, and it would sell for a small fortune back home.
All that music is made from field recordings that are manipulated to sound like beats or drums. And it became this, for a number of reasons, different circumstances and events that were going on in my own life and the events around making the film, it became this semi-fictional documentary that we took all this real footage but told made-up stories around it. We kind of created this fictional world where the ice caps were almost all melted except for this last island, which was Svalbard, where the trip was taken, and we were sent as this kind of last hope team to save it. And so each of the scenes that we filmed with the artists became part of that story. We wrote the story around it, essentially. I never narrate my own films. That's just an exception because the idea was that the footage was discovered from the ship, wreckage of the ship, and that's what you're watching. So my narration is supposed to be the kind of the ship's log, like the captain's log that had been written. But what that project really taught us, and that we made in 2012. We were talking about pitching earlier, and I guess some of you are students, you're going to do your pitches tomorrow. And I had always found pitching a bit strange, not that I was uncomfortable presenting my film ideas, but very often pitching just becomes, as I mentioned earlier as well, it becomes an invitation for everyone else to try and make your film, for them to tell you how they would make your film. And that's not particularly useful if you already have an idea or you have a very strong individual voice. And what I find, which we experimented with this film, is we just made a very bold pitch that we thought would polarize people. That either you would watch it, that trailer that I showed you, and think, what the hell is this? It's really pretentious, I don't get it, I'm not interested. Or they would say, I love it, I want to work with you on this film. And that's exactly what happened, that most people didn't want to do anything to do with it, which is fine. and the people that did ended up being funders. They supported it. We got Norwegian National Film Board money, and premiered in a really great festival in the Norwegian Arctic, and we won their award for Arctic films. And but it was really a lesson to all of us, me and the team that I always work with, that this kind of, that individuality of voice is really helpful. It's very useful and it's very valuable. That kind of tells people whether they want to get involved or not. And when you're looking to put a project together, I think a no is always better than a maybe, because a maybe is something that you're going to spend the next year or 2 years following up on and trying to get someone to email you back and meet up with the commissioning editor at the next festival and remind them who you are and you already met and this is my project. And very often if someone is not, especially people who are funding film, who are working with a lot of constraints, if they're not really immediately passionate about something, then they're probably not going to get involved. So at least a no saves you a lot of that time. So if you can present your film in a way that people will either love it or hate it, that would be my advice, because I find it a lot easier to work with those people who say definitely yes from the beginning. And when I talk about this sort of going, putting myself into a situation where I can experience in a different way. So for the Haifa film, it was about going into those houses. It was about getting in through the door and confronting the people selling that house directly through this kind of weird interface. When I made the film about the runner, I had to become a long-distance runner because I needed to understand how he lived his life, how he saw the world. I needed to understand that what it felt like when you start to run long distances and what that pain is like. And then practically I just had to, what? That's so funny. Oh, are you? Oh, great. Oh, cool. All right. We can talk about it some more. And then practically, obviously, I had to run with him, so I needed to be able to keep up with him in order to film. And I did, and I had a really interesting idea. I had seen another Danish documentary called Into Eternity. You guys seen this film? It's one of my favorite films. I think it's absolutely beautiful. About, well, it's really hard to explain. It's kind of about nuclear waste, but not really. But it's about the filmmaker that they have built or are building a nuclear waste bunker in Finland Finland. In the bedrock, they found the most solid rock they could find, and it's in Finland. So they're building this giant storage container, and it has to last for 100,000 years because that's the half-life of the nuclear waste that they're putting in there. And that's longer than anything that man has ever built has ever lasted. Much longer than we've ever built any, terrible sentence structure. You know what I'm trying to say. It would be the longest surviving structure humans have ever made. Okay, thank you. So the filmmaker asked a lot of people working on it these very profound questions about, okay, how do we know what the world is going to be like in 100,000 years? And so people building this thing had to think, okay, we need to put a warning sign so that people don't dig it up if they find it. But what language do we write it in? Because what if the Finnish language is unrecognizable in 10,000 years? So we have to build a sculpture that would be universally recognizable as, danger, keep out. And then they start to think, but wait, when we go to the Valley of the Kings and we see a sign that says, don't dig up this tomb or you'll die, we just go, yeah, whatever, we dig it up. So it became this incredibly profound, beautiful film about religion and the future, and that's a very long way of saying that there are these beautiful Steadicam shots in the film. Like really long, smooth takes. And as you saw in my earlier films, there's a lot of shaky camera because I just hold it myself and I run around with it. And so I thought, I want those long, beautiful takes. So we decided when we were making the runner to rent a Steadicam, and I had to lie and pretend that I already knew how to use one, otherwise they don't loan them out to you. But I can tell you they're pretty easy to figure out how to use on your own. and I wanted to run with the runner wearing a Steadicam, and I think this is probably one of the best things I've ever shot. I mean, it's also a bit messy in some ways. Oh, okay, I'll show you the end of this interview as well, because it kind of, this is, sometimes I do interviews on camera like this, but I always hold the camera, I never put it on a tripod. So I'll show you this bit as well, which I think is quite interesting.
شوف هذا جرح عادي ما عند حد اللي يقول فيه جرح شوف لأن الإنسان اللي أعطى مثلا هو أقلع عن الشيشم. أنا هذا استشهد معايا ياسر من أصحابي أصدقائي نختاروا عن خوتي نختاروا عن اللي لا أصدقاء ما نعرفهم لأنه مثلا الواحد نقعد نعرف اسمه وتوه ما نعرف بوه ولا نعرف استشهد معايا نرفدو وأنا انشرحت ويرفدوني واحدين ثانيين أصحابي اللي بقيهم قالين عليا وعندي أصدقاء نقيم حتى وأنا خوتي مشاو كاملين في الجبل مثلا استشهدوا كاملين استشهدوا كل شيء بقيت أنا وحدي فيه عائلتي كاملة مشات البو والأم والأخوت وكل شيء في الجبل كل شيء استشهد هذا هو تقريبا اللي عندي وشكرا
وأربع أشخاص توفوا في المستشفيات بعد إصابتهم أثناء الاشتباكات واعتقال وإيداعهم بالمستشفيات. تعرضوا لإصابات خطيرة توفوا على إثرها تم دفنهم بمدن مراكش وقدير العيون والسلام. 88 شخص توفوا خلال معارك متفرقة شهدتها المنطقة ما بين 75 و 89. إبراهيم بارك بن محمد سالم بن علي سالم بن محمد هذول أخوان يا البشير ولد خطري ولد علي مواليد 62 بكرة. عدد النساء أثناء احتجازهم بالثكنات العسكرية 11 امرأة فيما يلي قائمة أو كم ماتوا. فاطمة بنت الناصر مباركة بنت الدف ولد سيدي السالم فاطمة بنت بويا عمار.
أنت تعبت؟ شوية بس أنا حمشي يعني عضة كمل بس حمشي على طول مش هترجع؟ لا يلا كمل شوية لا رايح شوية
So I love that sequence because it, partly just because of the aesthetics of it, it was like we did exactly what I wanted to do, which was these long, uncut takes of the Steadicam moving slowly into the dark and the light and watching him run. But then you also have this you know, the turning to camera and talking to me, and then it becomes about the physicality of the film, and this kind of, you know, there's really me being the stupid guy with the camera, or looking like the dumb guy with the camera, but in a way that tells you a lot about the experience as well, which is that this is very painful and difficult, and obviously I'm wearing the camera, so it's harder for me, but you see his attitude towards it. And then it's also, again, this is the sort of middle of the film, like with I See the Stars at Noon, where he turns to camera and says something that sort of alters the course of the film a bit. This is his moment to turn to me and say, now you have to keep going. The whole film is about him trying to keep going. It's about him trying to essentially liberate his occupied country, but by running, by being a long-distance runner. And so the whole film is sort of me chasing him and him talking about longevity and having the will to go on. And then in the middle of the film, he turns to me and says, "No, now you have to go on a little more, right?" So it's got humor, and then it's got this almost like self-referential thing about cinema. And I just love the way he interacts with me. It's very, because he's quite distant for most of the film, but in this one scene, it's quite sweet, and there's this moment where he sort of becomes just a regular young guy that is sort of showing off but sort of supporting me at the same time. And I also wanted to show you the end of that interview, because hopefully you can see why when I'm holding the camera not on a tripod, you get a much more intimate interview, because I can move in, I can, even just seeing the movement of the hand on the screen, I think changes the dynamic of what the viewer is seeing. You're not receiving a signal that's like, oh, this is news, because it's perfectly framed and it's on a tripod. But you're seeing, oh, this is a conversation between these two guys. And I'm always looking for those little bits that give you more than you just get from the dialogue. So in that case, for me, it's the very end when he says, you know, everyone in my family was killed, my brother, my father, my mother, and that's it. Thank you very much. And he smiles really sweetly, you know, and you learn a lot more in that smile at the end than you do in an ordinary interview, just giving you information. So I'm always looking for these unique, special, weird, sometimes surreal moments that, yes, maybe they take me outside of the film for a split second, but I don't mind that. I like to sort of poke the viewer in the eye and say, don't forget, you're watching a documentary and there's someone here with a camera. But by taking you out, I think sometimes it becomes more powerful, because we're not in the sort of fictional constructed world anymore, but we're in I have to tell the story of my family dying for the 50th time to this guy. We're in that world. Or I have to answer this question for the first time, and it's a very basic question, but I don't know what to say. So that pause, you know, that look of awkwardness, or that silence. And one of the most powerful things you can do if you're talking to people on camera or interviewing them is just say nothing, and that you're giving them an opportunity to think. Sometimes you kind of create a bit of an awkward situation, and when there's silence, people usually want to fill it. And very often that's when you get to the really interesting stuff that you wanted. You finish an interview, and instead of going, okay, great, thanks, pack up all my gear, you just sit there. Sometimes it's just weird and nothing happens, but that's the chance you got to take. Other times, that's when someone says, but you know what? I'll tell you something else that happened. I've never told this to anyone. Because you're just there waiting. And there's this it gives them a chance to go, is there anything else I wanted to say? So, I think we're about, is now a good time to
absolutely.
To try and do
just
questions?
To open up for some Q&As. Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
When you are curious about an idea and you want to explore and research, do you just jump in the pool without securing the money? Like, do you pay your own investigations?
Yeah, I think the first hopefully you'll have made some money from your previous film, and then you can put that into your next film. Or I also film other people's documentaries, so I get paid for that, and I can put it into my own films. There are ways of getting your sort of research funded, and there are funds specifically to make a trailer tape or pitch tape. One of them is called Catapult. That's an American fund. One of them, actually, BritDoc just kind of relaunched their, what do they call it?
Well, it's a new fund. I think it's Pulse Films.
Yeah, Pulse. Yeah. So BritDoc and Pulse.
They've had like different partnerships before. Puma.
Yeah, it was Puma.
It's a different partnership.
Yeah. So BritDoc and Pulse, and they have, I think, £5,000 to fund a pitch tape. And that can work. I've never had any luck with those funds, but usually because my films they just start out with very, I think, indistinct ideas often, and I need to, even before I can put something on paper, I usually need to film. So I start filming so early in the process that usually it's not enough for those guys. It's very hard to get the balance, because if you're too early, they're not going to give you money. If you film too much, then you don't need a pitch tape anymore. So you kind of have to fake it a bit, but if you can get funding, and it doesn't have to be from a film fund, you can get funding to do research, and you just bring a camera with you. That's always a great way of doing it. You can say to someone, can I come with you and be your camera assistant, and they pay your costs to get to Bangkok, and when you're there, you'll make your pitch tape for whatever film you're making, whatever it might be. But yes, any chance of getting funding for your film is almost always going to have to be accompanied by some material. But that's also a really good way of you knowing whether you really have a film or not. You might think you've got a great idea, and then you go and film it, and for some reason it doesn't work. I need to know as early as possible, what is this going to look like on camera? Because, there's a funny irony with film is there's so much theory about it, and we can talk about it for months, but when you're done, all you have is this two-dimensional surface, and it's just light and dark and some sound. So people watching it don't care if you had an amazing idea, and then you started filming, and it looks terrible. They don't know what your amazing idea was. All they see is what you see on the screen. So not every story translates well into film. I hear a lot of pitches that I think that's a photography project. Just do it as stills. Or that's a report, just write a report. If your whole film is like slides and information, then just make a slideshow. You don't need to make a film. So not every story always matches the medium of film. If there's nothing moving and happening in real time, unfolding in front of the camera, I think then it's probably not a documentary. You know what I mean? Other questions?
When you said that you sometimes put your voice in the film, sometimes you don't. Do you decide that in the edit, or do you pre-decide it before you set out?
No, usually I'll decide before, depending on the mood of the film. I mean, my narration I never do. I just did it for the Arctic film as an experiment. But yeah, in terms of actually speaking from behind the camera, either it's already decided, like if I'm shooting someone else's documentary, then it's pretty clear. On my own, I like to do it early because once you have it in, it's very hard to cut around it. But of course, there's, even in films without my voice, there's tons of footage where you hear my voice because I'm just talking to people. But there are certain circumstances where I know I'm not gonna talk. And there's a whole art, I think, to non-verbal communication. So you get, not only being able to communicate to people without talking. So in that interview you saw there, I don't know if you noticed, but near the end I sort of very slowly lean in, and I could feel like he was about to say something that was maybe a little deeper than what he was talking about. So I wanted to lean in, and maybe in leaning in, he also thought, oh, he's interested. I'm gonna expound. I'm going to say a little more. So you're always, you know, there's this dialogue going on between you and the people in the film. And when I'm, you know, if I film for an 8-hour day or a 10-hour day, I'm exhausted by the end of it. I feel like I've run a marathon because I'm hyper aware of everything around me. It's like this light source, I can hear the rain over there, I can see the look on your face, and so I think, am I losing this guy? Then I might think someone's going to come in the door, I have to get that shot. And you're always looking at the tiniest twitch in someone's eye that's going to tell you, oh, they're about to leave the room, then I have to be ready for that. Or now they're comfortable, they're about to talk about something, let me move in closer. And you become this kind of just sponge of every dynamic that's going on in the room, all at the same time. And because I like filming long, uncut sequences, so everything is this kind of very meticulous movement of the camera and following people's moods and conversations. And so you're trying to find as much predictability as you can in an unpredictable situation. But certainly when you first walk into a room or a location, the first thing you should be thinking is where is my light coming in? Where is there sound that's going to be an issue? If someone leaves the room, where are they going to leave the room? So I need to be ready to film them leaving the room. If someone new comes in, which way is he going to be facing to say hello? Am I on the right side? Etc. All that kind of stuff. Right? So that level of activity is just exhausting. Which is also why I'm not one of these filmmakers that films everything. You know, there's a lot of advice that you'll get very often in documentary, which is film everything. I completely disagree. I think if you film everything, you end up with a film that looks like you filmed everything. There's no deliberate, you don't get a sense of deliberate authorship. You don't get a sense that this is the most important thing going on in the room right now. You get a sense that I'm just vacuuming in information and then I'm going to format it in a different way. And I also don't think we can pay attention and be really good camera people and be hyper attentive to everything everyone is saying for 12 hours a day for 6 months non-stop. It's just impossible. You know, after 3 or 4 days, I'm just a wreck. You can imagine, like in Afghanistan on an army base or on the front line, there's no way you can shoot everything for days on end and still have it be good material and still have a clear mind. You know, if halfway through your film you're still filming everything, then you have no idea what you're filming. So that's not focus, you know. I think you need to know very quickly what you're focusing on, and that's what you film. I would much rather miss a scene than have it covered really badly and messily because I thought, oh, I gotta shoot it. I'd much rather have another scene that I'm really deliberately shot with purpose and with feeling. That becomes what drives your film.
I wanted to ask you about your relationship with your editor.
Yeah.
Because you talked about it a bit earlier today, but we all know that, you know, so much of documentary comes together in the edit room. And although I can tell from what you're talking about in your filming that there's so much you are deliberately filming, and so how much of an edit are you kind of doing as you're filming, and at what point does the editor come into the project? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, Gareth has been my editor since our first film, 2004, and I would strongly recommend, you know, having a team that you know and that you work with and that you trust, because that's worth more than someone who's done 30 docs and won 2 Oscars. You know, if you don't speak the same language, metaphorically, obviously not literally, then it's no help at all. That talent is just useless. You need to be working in the same direction. I'm terrible, absolutely terrible with structure, scene construction. Even though I know every time I film I have to shoot to edit, and I know someone's going to be editing this material, I'm just absolutely horrible at thinking of those kind of things, no matter how hard I try. So even when and I think it has to do with, I have weird memory issues. For example, my sense of direction and space is just abysmal. I mean, literally, I can walk into a room and then walk out and not know which direction I came from, like that kind of thing. And I think that affects the way I see the structure of a film. The Tell Spring, I must have watched it 30 times, but still, if someone says to me, "Where's the scene with the bird?" I can't say. I couldn't tell you. Oh, it's about 3/4 of the way through. It's really bizarre. I don't know why. But what it means is I'm terrible at structuring a documentary. Gareth, the editor, and the musician who does sound and composition, they're both phenomenal with structure. So I work with them as early as possible. Whenever I have any material, I'll show it to Gareth, just so he knows what we're going to work with. And when I have a story idea, I'll talk to Joe, the composer, about it. Because he's brilliant at just saying, "Oh, this is connected to this, and remember this guy," and he could bring him in here. I work very visually, so I'll have a wall in an edit suite with index cards in every scene, and then you move them around. And that way at least I don't need to memorize the order of things. But I always want to talk to Gareth as soon as possible, because I know otherwise you'll just get. And that's one of the reasons why there aren't really plots in my films, because very often they just can't sustain a plot. But it's also, I just work so instinctively that if I think, yeah, this is interesting, I'll make a scene out of it. I have no idea whether it's going to fit. I have no idea if it's consistent with what comes before and after it. So I rely massively on Gareth. I mean, I can edit in the sense that I can use software and cut scenes together, but I can't structure a narrative.
And because there's so much material after shooting for like a whole year, are you selecting that footage before you hand it over to Gareth, or is he dealing with that whole, amount of rushes?
No, we watch everything together. Yeah, we'll go through the whole thing. And I have an approach. Usually what we'll do is watch everything together, and then on paper, and then I do as much work on paper as possible. So I watch everything, I don't touch it again until much later down the line. So we'll write everything on index cards, we start moving it around, but I do a lot on that, maybe like 70%. And then you go back and start cutting. And my theory is that so when we're writing the cards also we don't look at the footage. We just go by what we remember. And my theory is if you don't remember it, it's probably not very good. So I don't have this like, oh, what if there's, oh no, remember that amazing scene, we totally forgot about it. It doesn't happen, because I think if it does, it's probably trying to tell you something. There's a reason why you forgot it, because it doesn't fit. So again, it's quite instinctive, which is why you need someone who's a lot more, meticulous and organized to work with that sort of instinctual approach. Does that make sense? You know what I mean? Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
In your clip from the documentary in Morocco, your character mentioned that you paid him 200 euros.
Yeah.
But I understand you didn't pay him as a subject, you simply wanted to help him.
Yeah.
And then later you said that making a film means definitely exploiting your subject.
Yeah.
So I was curious to know what's your opinion about paying the subject, whether
right.
it's something that you consider justified.
That's really difficult, and I had a lot of trouble. I mean, ethically on the first film, because that scene is him. It's where he asked me to pay him, and I said, I have the money. Obviously, I have 200 euro. It's not that much money to me, but I said, what happens if I give you the money, you get on a boat and you drown? How am I supposed to tell your mother that I helped you? Or then, think of what I have to live with, the guilt, if I give you that money and something happens to you. I tried to justify it to myself by along the lines of the ethics of journalism, where you never pay people who are in your film. And I think that's a good standard. But if someone could change their life, and my 200 euro could help them change their life, what's more important then? Is it more important for me to stick to the ethics of journalism, or to do a very basic thing that could help someone out? So by the end of it, I said, what I decided myself to make myself feel better is that at the end of everything, I would give him the money. Because I felt like by that time he was my friend, and if a friend said, can I have €200 to try and make my life better, I would say yes. But that's a real extreme circumstance. I haven't ever paid anyone since then. That's a very specific circumstance. And I would really suggest you don't pay people, but that doesn't mean you don't, it doesn't mean you don't help people. So, for example, one of the soldiers that I met in Afghanistan, I'm in touch with a lot of them on Facebook. And one of them mentioned, he said, my brother has a form of blood cancer, and I don't have the money to take him to Pakistan to get treatment. So I just ran a really quick crowdfunding campaign, and we raised about £2,700, and I gave it to him for his brother. Now he's getting treatment. So I don't feel like once the film is over, it's over. There are ways that we can help people or support them or work with them that are not just paying them to be in the film. Another one of those soldiers, actually several of them, are now trying to get to Europe as refugees. And one of them is in Germany, and now he's using footage from the film to make his case. So we've given him some of the interviews, and his lawyer, if they can use it to show that it's unsafe for him to go back to Afghanistan. So I think it's a long-term relationship, and we can give back without having to pay people.
Question here?
We'll start up. Yeah, go ahead.
I suppose it's maybe a follow-up from that point. You said you like to poke the audience in the eye sometimes.
Yeah.
And that kind of scene very specifically did that in a way. It kind of addressed something straight to the audience. I suppose my question is, what impact do you think that has on the audience when you break that wall? And it's something that the audience has got to realise this is something that's happening, it's real. Or what effect or reaction are you trying to achieve with that?
The most important thing for me is to get people to think about how those kinds of stories are told in their media. So that's the effect I'm trying to achieve mostly above everything else, is for them to say, oh, okay, this is another piece of news media, for example. But how is it different from the news I see every day? Or how is it different from all the other documentaries I've seen? So I like it as a kind of spark to start this sort of internal dialogue within the viewer. But I think aesthetically it also disrupts the narrative. A lot of people don't like that in my films because it kind of breaks its flow. But I think sometimes you want to break that flow because otherwise it's very easy for everything to exist only within the world of cinema. And particularly what I always want to ask is, what are the ethics of us as filmmakers? Because I'm so critical of how news is produced and documentaries are made, I want it to be harder for the next filmmaker to say, oh, I'm totally neutral, I have nothing to do with the story. I want that dialogue to exist. I'll give you an example. There was a filmmaker who's pretty famous now, a British filmmaker. And he made a film in Gaza. And he was in a hospital, and there was bombing, and he was filming people who were injured. And someone asked him in the Q&A, how did you get permission to film inside that hospital? And he said, oh, well, that's the great thing about Gaza, is they don't have the same system of informed consent that we have here. So you don't need permission to go into a hospital and film. So this is what I was saying earlier, is that for a lot of filmmakers, those kinds of structures are there to get in their way when they're making a film. It hadn't occurred to him that informed consent is to protect the people who are vulnerable in a hospital, not to make your lawyer check a box at home. So I have that in mind all the time, because that's for me, one of the most offensive things I've heard a filmmaker say. It totally goes against everything I've ever been dedicated to as a filmmaker. So when I do my little provocations, I want to start that dialogue. So that next time they look at one of his films, they can go, oh, but what about the person in the hospital bed? You know. Yeah, you had a question?
Yeah, I just want to know how important it is for you to be a cameraman in your film.
Yeah, I can't direct without being behind the camera. For me, it's the same thing, because that relationship between the person in front of the camera and behind the camera is so central to my films. So it's absolutely essential. I mean, it's even when I film other people's documentaries, I find it a bit awkward because then the center of gravity is always shifting between the director and you. I don't really do it that often. I'm not a kind of gigging camera guy who gets work all the time. When I get asked to film something, it's usually based on my sort of weird approach. So they know they want something a bit different, and they don't hire me and then say, just do what I say. You know, is what I mean. So, but yes, because that movement of the camera and the relationship between the camera and the people, and that use of the camera as a tool for exploring the world is for me so fundamental to documentary that it doesn't make sense to give the camera to anyone else. Sometimes I have other camera people who film with me, but I need to be there holding it. Yeah. Yeah.
What type of cameras are you using usually?
You know, it depends. I don't own any equipment. I don't think it's efficient for me to own anything. I just rent for each job, but different films require different cameras, and it depends. I'm very geeky about cameras. I really like cameras and new tech, and I'm very interested in how they work. And I think you need to know everything you can about that camera and then forget about it. It needs to be second nature. So whatever it is that you're using, as long as you're comfortable enough with it that it's almost just like an extension of your limbs, and you're not dazzled by the technology, because a lot of filmmaking is just about the novelty of what we can achieve technically. Well, we all know what we can achieve now. It's really not exciting to me anymore. What's exciting is how you use it. So, when I'm filming undercover, I need a camera that looks like a tourist camera, or an SLR that just looks like it's stills but it's shooting video. In Afghanistan, we used the C300, the Canon C300, Canon lenses on it. In the Arctic, I used the Sony F3, which is just really tough, and manual lenses, so there were no... the F3 is like a tank, so in freezing conditions, it's fine, you can bash it around, nothing's going to happen. There's solid metal Nikon lenses, no zoom, so there's not too many moving parts. So it really depends. There's nothing... I'm excited by new cameras, but it's much more important for me that the camera matches the project.
Just thinking about your team, do you have a producer, do you do co-productions, have you got a production company?
Yeah.
Or do you produce yourself?
All of those. So I have my own production company. The company doesn't do anything except make our films. So we don't have an office, we don't have equipment. It's just a legal entity for us to operate in. And then I will produce all my own films, and then other producers will work with me. I haven't found a producer that's been consistent through all my films. So editor and co-writer, yes, same guy. He's been a friend of mine for 20 years now. Composer, same guy. Sound guy also. But producer, for some reason, I haven't found one that I can stick with. I keep trying to get the SDI to produce my films, but it still hasn't worked out. But I think they're on the same wavelength as me, so I'm trying to figure that out. Even if you are not actually the producer, if you're not raising money on your film and going out hustling, you still need to call yourself a producer, because in the documentary world, the producer owns the project. The producer is the originator of a project. So it's not... Well, in a way, it's like fiction. If you win Best Film at the Oscars, who does the award go to? It goes to the producer, not the director. So within most Western, let's say Anglo-American film industry is the producer is the owner of a project. So in documentary, if you're interested in credits and potential awards and how your film is perceived on IMDb, you have to be a producer of your film, because then you own that property. And then you bring other people on who might actually raise money. And
yeah, so you're looking for producers just to raise money and distribute at the end, or is it more than that?
So far I haven't. Yes, no. I mean, they also input creatively, but not so much. Not in the sense that they're sort of guiding the film. No, it's more. For me, the producer, other than myself, is helping you raise money, but also just overseeing the whole project. So they're going to be communicating with a potential sales agent, for example. That's something a producer would do, and it's more just someone who's better than I am at that. I'm not great with hustling and money, and I can produce my own films if I have to, but I don't. I also think it just distracts too much from the actual filmmaking. And then there's a lot of co-producers, so I tend to work with a lot of other countries, mainly because I just don't get funding from British funds. Their priorities are very different from mine in terms of the type of films I'm making. So I've worked with Norway a lot. They're also into different types of filmmaking. And France has been really good supporting The Runner, 2 documentaries ago. Germany. So you need to find a producer in those countries. And I also, there's a French producer that I would always work with. There's a Norwegian producer I would always work with. So I would also consider them part of the team. Any other questions? Yeah.
Has anyone ever approached you with a project where you thought this film should be made, but just not by me? Or would you then try to find kind of your own way of telling that story, but something that was more adapted to who you are?
Yeah, it happens a lot. I mean, like I said, people don't come to me that often because I don't put myself out as a sort of filmmaker for hire. But when people do come to me, the majority of the time, they're not for me. It's not my kind of project. But because I have this sort of community of filmmakers around me, and I also teach, so all of those students then become filmmakers, and so I always try and be very attentive about pointing people in another direction, and also explaining very clearly why it's not the kind of project for me. So I do get quite a lot of people who want to make these sort of mega docs with me. We got to make a film about the financial crisis, and so I think, okay, but my film, if I'm following one person with a camera, how are we going to tell that story about the financial crisis? So there's usually a kind of clash, and to be honest, I'm just not a good employee. I'm not good at working for other people. So with Mike, when he approached me about the Afghan film, I had to be very honest from the beginning. I said, look, if we're going to, either we co-direct and we both are equally in charge, or I'll put you in touch with someone else. If you want like a camera person and you're just going to tell me what to do, it's never going to work, because I'm just terrible at working.
Which
Mike
Mike?
McAvoy, who co-directed the Afghan film. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh, it's fine. Yeah, good. Hey, thank you.